November 1941. Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe, now the only gap left in a ring of German and Finnish steel, closed around 3 million people. A single transport plane lifts off from an airfield east of the lake, in total blackout, no navigation lights, engines throttled back as low as the pilot dares to keep the sound from carrying to German flak positions on the southern shore. Its cargo is not bombs and not soldiers. It is flour, sacks of it, stacked against the fuselage walls of an airplane that carries no name anyone remembers today, flown by a crew whose job has no glory attached to it at all. Just a slow, low, terrified crossing of open water, at night, unarmed against fighters that could end the flight in a single pass. If the plane makes it, it lands inside a city already eating wallpaper paste for the glue in it. If it does not, the 250 grams of bread that keeps one worker alive for one more day simply does not arrive. There is no gun camera footage of this flight. No enemy ace will ever claim it as a kill, because if the plane goes down, it will most likely be to flak fire, engine failure, or simple bad luck over open, freezing water, where a downed crew has minutes, not hours, before the cold finishes what the Germans started. Pause on that. This is not a story about an ace, and it is not a story about a dogfight. This channel has told you about the fighters that killed with style, the Airacobras, the Kitty Hawks, the Mustangs with 6 kills in an afternoon. This is the story of an unglamorous transport aircraft that may have done more to keep the Soviet Union alive in its worst winter than any fighter this channel has ever covered, and whose real identity is more complicated and more American than its own crews probably ever stopped to think about. Part 1. An American Blueprint, Built Under License. The aircraft at the center of this story began life not as a Soviet design at all, but as the Douglas DC-3, the American airliner that reshaped commercial aviation in the 1930s. In 1938, before Lend-Lease existed, before the German invasion, the Soviet Union negotiated a licensing agreement directly with Douglas Aircraft to build the DC-3 domestically, complete with technical documentation, tooling rights, and engineering consultation. Soviet engineers spent months converting the entire airframe from imperial measurements to metric, reworking the structure to accommodate Soviet-built engines, and adapting it for the rougher airfields and harsher climate the aircraft would actually operate in. The first Soviet-built example flew in 1939, designated the PS-84, built at a plant outside Moscow. It would not be renamed the Li-2, after lead engineer Boris Lisanov, until September 1942. Nearly a year into the story this video is actually about. When the German army encircled Leningrad, the aircraft the city depended on to survive was not a Lend-Lease gift crossing the Pacific or the Arctic convoys. It was already being built inside the Soviet Union under an American license signed 3 years before the war began. The 1938 agreement itself was unusual for its era. The Soviet Union was not a natural trading partner for major American manufacturers, and Douglas's willingness to license its most advanced commercial airliner reflected both the money on the table and a pre-war world where such deals still felt like ordinary business rather than strategic risk. Within the plant outside Moscow, engineers wrestled with problems no manual could fully answer. How to substitute Soviet aluminum alloys for the American originals. How to mate domestic radial engines to an airframe designed around Wright cyclones, and how to keep tolerances tight enough for an aircraft that would eventually need to operate off frozen dirt strips instead of paved American runways. By the time the first PS-84s reached operational units, the airplane was recognizably a DC-3 in silhouette and structure, but it was, in every practical sense, a Soviet-built machine. Part 2. The Ring Closes. On September 8, 1941, German forces cut the last land route into Leningrad, sealing roughly 3 million people, soldiers and civilians together, inside a siege that would last 872 days. 5 days later, on September 13th, the first PS-84 transport flights into the city began. A week after that, on September 20th, the State Defense Committee issued an order allocating 50 PS-84 aircraft, soon increased to 64, to the Moscow Special Purpose Aviation Group, tasked with flying cargo in and people out. The initial capacity was around 100 tons of freight per day. By October 1st, improved organization pushed that to 150 tons daily. It sounds substantial until you remember what it was being measured against. A city of roughly 3 million people that before the war imported the overwhelming majority of its food from outside the immediate region. 150 tons of flour and ammunition, flown in by aircraft that could each carry only a few tons at a time, was never going to be enough on its own. It was a stopgap, flown by pilots who understood exactly how thin the margin was. The Moscow Special Purpose Aviation Group, known in Soviet records by its abbreviation MAGON, drew crews from civilian airline service as much as from military aviation, men who had flown mail routes and passenger service before the war, and now found themselves flying the same airframes into a war zone with no training pipeline built for the job they were suddenly doing. Alongside food and ammunition, the return flights out of Leningrad carried something just as important to the wider war effort: skilled factory workers and engineers the Soviet state judged too valuable to lose to starvation or bombardment, men and women who would go on to staff relocated defense plants deep in the Urals and Siberia. The air bridge, in other words, was not simply feeding a city. It was preserving a slice of Soviet industrial capacity that the state considered irreplaceable, one overloaded transport flight at a time. Part 3. The Worst Month. By November 1941, conditions inside Leningrad had become the grimmest of the entire siege. Bread rations for factory workers fell to 250 grams a day. For everyone else, dependents, children, the elderly, it was 125 grams, roughly 2 thin slices, and often adulterated with cellulose and other fillers just to make the flour stretch further. The overland ice road across Lake Ladoga, the route later immortalized as the Road of Life, did not become reliably usable for truck traffic until late November, once the ice had thickened enough to bear weight. For the weeks in between, the only route into the city that did not run through German or Finnish lines was the air corridor. Crews of the Moscow Special Purpose Aviation Group flew that corridor low over the lake, in blackout conditions, navigating largely by memory and dead reckoning, watching for the German fighters and flak batteries positioned along the southern shoreline the enemy now controlled. Landing fields on the Leningrad side were primitive, sometimes under intermittent artillery fire themselves. Between September and December 1941, these flights evacuated roughly 50,000 people out of the city, many of them skilled workers, engineers, and children, while delivering some 5,000 tons of cargo, most of it food. Neither number, on its own, sounds like it could keep a city alive. Together, for those specific weeks before the ice road opened, they were the only thing standing between the ring closing completely and at least some lifeline staying open. Witness accounts from Leningrad's darkest winter describe conditions that made every stage of this operation harder than it should have been. Ground crews serviced aircraft in open-air conditions, at temperatures that made engine oil congeal, and metal fatigue in ways no pre-war maintenance manual anticipated. Pilots navigated largely by memorized landmarks and dead reckoning, because instrument approaches and reliable radio navigation aids were scarce, and because flying with any electronic emission risked drawing the attention of German direction-finding equipment along the shore. Loading crews worked in the dark, by feel, racing the clock before dawn light made the aircraft visible to German patrols. None of this made for a heroic newsreel. It made for exhausted people doing repetitive, dangerous work because the alternative, multiplied across a city of 3 million, was mass starvation. Some flights carried more than cargo in the ordinary sense. Doctors and medical supplies moved into the city on the same aircraft that carried out the wounded and the starving. And Soviet accounts describe children evacuated in conditions so cramped that crews stacked them alongside freight simply because there was no other way to fit enough people into a single sortie. Every seat not filled with a passenger was, in the calculus of that winter, a seat that should have been filled with flour instead. A trade-off crews made sortie by sortie, with no formula to tell them they were getting it right. Part 4. Not actually unarmed. Here is where the honest version of this story has to correct its own title. The PS-84 and the Li-2 that followed it were not literally unarmed. Military conversions of the airframe mounted a manually operated defensive machine gun in a dorsal position. intended to give the crew at least some chance against a fighter attack from above or behind. It was a token defense at best, a single hand-aimed machine gun against a Messerschmitt closing at well over 300 miles an hour offered no real parity. But it means the framing of a completely defenseless airplane flying into danger isn't quite accurate. What made these aircraft vulnerable was not a total absence of weapons, it was everything else about them. They were slow. They could not maneuver against a fighter. They flew fixed, predictable routes over open water with no cover, at altitudes low enough to avoid German radar, but high enough to be seen by anyone watching from the shore. Soviet wartime records and post-war accounts document aircraft and crews lost on the Ladoga air route throughout the siege, casualties that rarely made it into the more celebrated combat narratives this channel usually tells, because there was no kill count to report, no ace to name. Just crews who kept flying the same exposed corridor night after night because the alternative was a city that starved faster. Compare that to the fighters this channel usually covers, aircraft built from the outset to fight and armored specifically around the pilot's survival in a gunfight. The PS-84 and Li-2 were built to move cargo efficiently, with defensive armament added almost as an afterthought once the war made it necessary. That distinction matters because it means every loss on the Ladoga air route was, in a sense, a design compromise made visible. An airliner conscripted into a role it was never optimized to survive, doing that job anyway because there was no better aircraft available to do it instead. Part 5. A workhorse beyond Leningrad. The PS-84 and Li-2 did not stop mattering once the worst of the Leningrad famine passed. Across the rest of the war, the type became one of the most widely used Soviet aircraft in existence, ferrying supplies to partisan units operating behind German lines, dropping airborne troops in several major operations, and evacuating wounded from frontline airstrips back to hospitals in the rear. Production expanded well beyond the original Moscow area plant, once a second line opened in Tashkent in January 1942, output climbing from a few hundred aircraft that year to well over 600 annually by 1943 and 1944. By the war's end, thousands of these aircraft had passed through Soviet service in a role that never generated the mythology of a fighter squadron, but that touched nearly every front the Red Army fought on. Leningrad's air bridge was the aircraft's defining early trial, but it was far from its only wartime job. Part 5. What Americas really means here. And this is the second correction the title owes you. Calling this America's cargo plane is true in the sense that mattered least to the people it saved, and true in the sense that mattered most to how the aircraft came to exist at all. It is not true in the way Lend-Lease usually gets credited in these videos. This was not a gift shipped across the Arctic convoys or flown over from Alaska along the LZB ferry route. Those deliveries of actual American-built C-47s, roughly 700 of them over the whole war, came later, and mostly served other fronts and later campaigns, not the September to December 1941 crisis this video is built around. The aircraft that flew Leningrad's air bridge in its darkest weeks was a Soviet-manufactured PS-84, built on Soviet soil by Soviet workers under an American engineering license signed in peacetime. It saved Leningrad's air corridor not because Washington sent it in an hour of need, but because Douglas Aircraft had sold the Soviet Union the right to build it, years before anyone involved knew there would be a war to fight. The rescue, in other words, was American in its DNA and Soviet in its execution, which is a more interesting and more honest story than either a pure Lend-Lease triumph narrative or a purely homegrown Soviet one. It also means the usual language this channel uses, enemy pilots fearing an American machine, or German commanders unable to explain how American engineering beat them, does not quite fit here, because the Germans encircling Leningrad were not fighting an American aircraft at all in any operational sense. They were fighting a Soviet transport unit flying a Soviet-built airframe that happened to trace its lineage to an American design office. The video's own hook, in that sense, is really a story about origins and paperwork as much as it is about combat. It is a distinction worth sitting with, because it cuts against the version of this story that would be easiest to tell. The easy version says, America built the plane that saved Leningrad, full stop. a clean Lend-Lease hero narrative. The honest version says something more specific, and, in its way, more remarkable. A pre-war commercial licensing deal between a capitalist aircraft company and a country the United States was not yet allied with, signed for entirely unsentimental business reasons in 1938, happened to leave the Soviet Union with a domestically producible transport aircraft exactly when it needed one most. No one involved in that 1938 negotiation could have known what the airplane would be asked to do 3 years later. It is a reminder that the alliances history remembers as inevitable were, at the time they were made, nothing of the sort. Just ordinary transactions between countries that would, within a few short years, find themselves fighting the same enemy for reasons neither side fully anticipated when the paperwork was signed. It is also worth being honest about scale. The air bridge was the only route into Leningrad for a critical stretch of autumn 1941, but it was never going to be the route that sustained the city for all 872 days of the siege. Once the ice road opened in late November, and once a rail and barge supply chain further east matured over 1942 and 1943, the overwhelming majority of Leningrad's wartime supply moved by ice, water, and rail, not by air. The PS-84 and Li-2 kept flying cargo and evacuation missions throughout the siege, and remained critical during the spring and autumn windows when the ice was too thin for trucks and too thick for barges. But calling this one aircraft type the city's last lifeline for the entire blockade would overstate its role. Its real claim to this story is narrower, and honestly, more remarkable. For the specific weeks when Leningrad had no other way in or out at all, this was the only aircraft flying that corridor, and its crews knew exactly what was riding in the cargo hold behind them every single night. The airplane that flew those missions never got a nickname from the Germans, the way the Sturmovik or the Katyusha did. No wartime song was written about it. Post-war Soviet aviation history remembers the Li-2 mostly as a workhorse transport, a footnote next to the fighters and bombers that get their names carved onto monuments. But somewhere in Leningrad today, among the people whose grandparents survived that first winter, there are families who exist because a flour sack made it across Lake Ladoga in the dark in an unglamorous cargo plane built from an American blueprint, flown by a crew nobody wrote a citation for. Walk through St. Petersburg's memorials to the siege today, and you will find monuments to the ice road, to the metronome broadcasts that kept the city's pulse audible over the radio, to the symbolic ration card with its scant grams of bread printed for visitors to hold. You will not easily find a monument to the transport crews who flew the corridor before that ice road even existed, in the weeks when the sky was the only road left. Their aircraft carried no guns worth mentioning in a combat report, scored no victories, and earned no nickname from friend or enemy. It simply kept flying, night after night, until there was another way in. That, in the end, is the least cinematic kind of heroism a war produces, and possibly the kind that mattered most to the people counting grams of bread by candlelight, waiting to hear engines in the dark. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in the story of the aircraft history almost forgot.